Okay, welcome again to Using Job Postings Data to Analyze the Labor Demand Impact of COVID-19. My name is Chmura. I'm the CEO and Chief Economist of Chmura Economics and Analytics, and I'm joined today by James Stinkum, and he's a Jobs EQ economist with us. He's in our Cleveland office, and I'm in Richmond, Virginia. So just a little background on who is Chmura in case you don't know us. We provide labor market data and analysis so our clients can make informed decisions to help their communities thrive. We were founded in 1998, and we have offices in Richmond and Cleveland. We're about 40 economists, data statisticians, and business professionals who really care about helping you grow your community, and we're driven by your satisfaction and success. We have a consulting side of the business as well as our Jobs EQ software. Many of you are probably Jobs EQ clients, and excellence is our first priority. At the end of the day and at the beginning of the day, that's why we're here, and that's what drives the work that we do. And customer service, if you've used our services, either Jobs EQ or consulting, you know that customer service is a real priority, as is data quality. So just a couple of administrative things. Please ask questions in the chat box on the right side of your screen. And also, we'll provide copies of the slides and a tape of the webinar this afternoon for those of you who would like to look at that. So beginning with this presentation, first we're going to look at the national economy. And in most places around the globe, a recession is defined as 2 consecutive drops in gross domestic product. Here in the U.S., though, we have a group, National Bureau of Economic Research, and within that group, the Business Cycle Dating Committee that looks at monthly data. GDP is quarterly and determines when a recession starts. So they determined it started in February this past year. All economists that I know are expecting to see a rebound in the third quarter of GDP. I'll show you our forecast, and that data, those numbers are coming out at the end of this month. Pre-COVID employment levels, though, clearly GDP is going to rebound very quickly, but employment levels are going to come back more slowly, and that's going to be dependent on a vaccine, and also the degree to which companies come back or firms come back will vary based on the industry. And then after I give you a brief overview of the national economy, James will talk to you about using job postings data to measure COVID-19's impact and the impact too on states. So on the national side, the important thing is that pre-COVID, the economy was fundamentally strong. There was no economist that I know of who was looking for recessions to start in this year. These gray shaded areas are recessions. Here's the last recession. So here I'm showing you non-farm employment. You can see how severely it dropped when we got to March, and then the rebound that we're starting to see. And you can see a little bit here that rebound is slowing a bit in terms of some businesses have gone out of business, and so they won't be coming back. But we'll talk more in a little bit about when we expect to get to pre-COVID levels. Income and consumption. So this is spending by consumers on services and goods. When we went into the recession, dropped off considerably, but here we're seeing it come back at a pace faster than most economists had expected. Income jumped when we saw some money flowing from the federal government in terms of higher unemployment insurance, as well as money going to families to help to support them during this recession. And you can see that income has come down to more normal times, so it's above 5% from a year ago. Industrial production represents output from manufacturing, utilities, and mining. And you can see again the huge drop off, but again, it's starting to come back at a pretty good clip, faster than many economists had expected. So clearly, this economy was fundamentally strong as we went into this period of lockdown because of the COVID virus. In terms of GDP, so this is the broadest indicator of economic activity. You can see the decline in the first quarter and the second quarter, a huge decline, about a 27% annualized decline. Now, a rebound that we're looking for is about 21%. Economists are looking for anything between 16 and 30% rebound in economic activity. And then you see over the next year or so, it's staying around 5%. Anything above 2% is considered very good growth. So coming out of this virus, we're looking at a year and a half, 2 years of very good growth, making up for these losses that we saw during the beginning of it. Now, economists vary in terms of their forecasts, but the one thing that we all agree on is that it's going to be sharp and short and not sustained. And that's on the GDP side. On the employment side, the economic recovery in terms of getting people back to work is very dependent on a vaccine. So right now we've got at least 9 vaccine candidates in phase 3 trials, 7 being funded in part by the US. And again, typically it takes 5 years to 10 years before we get a vaccine. And then once we get the vaccine, it usually takes a year to ramp up the manufacturing of it to get it out to the public. So we're still assuming that we have a vaccine in early 2021 and widely available at least by the second quarter, or this is what they were saying earlier. And we've actually gotten more optimistic about that given what the medical community has been saying. As I said, that it usually takes about a year to manufacture the vaccine once it is made, but the Health and Human Services as well as Department of Defense made an agreement with Moderna to start to manufacture those doses right now with the assumption that they're going to pass the study so that when we know that it is effective, they could start to distribute it right away. And that announcement was made in mid-August, and the CDC started to plan in September for distribution. So that's another issue that has to be dealt with. How do we get it out to everyone? And so the government right now is being very proactive in making sure that once a good vaccine is available, that it is made available to the public as soon as possible. So here we have now, this is employment, and we have 3 scenarios of when the vaccine becomes available. So we've indexed this to 100 so that pre-COVID, the employment level is 100. So then you can see the loss here. We've got down to 90%. So you have a 10% loss in jobs. And these couple of points are actual data. And then now we see what is the likely path back in terms of getting to pre-COVID levels. So the FAST, the green one that I was showing here, this would assume that we have the vaccine in the first quarter of 2021, widely distributed. If that were the case, then we could see employment to pre-COVID levels by the second quarter. That's a very optimistic. What we think is more likely, though, is that we would see the vaccine widely available in the second quarter of 2021. No further shutdowns of all states, and in that case, we'd see pre-COVID levels of employment 2 to 3 quarters later. So we're looking at end of 2021, early 2022, and that's this path that you see here before we get to the pre-COVID levels. Our worst case scenario is the slow here, where you see we don't get a vaccine until the fourth quarter of 2022, more infections, and from that perspective, we may not see employment to pre-COVID levels until 2023. So all of the economists' forecasts are based on when they expect to see the vaccine. And again, ours is the vaccine is likely to be widely distributed by the second quarter of 2021. So I pulled this article because I think it seems that we're getting weary of this. It seems like COVID will never go away. And Ken Budd of The Atlantic wrote a really nice article that appeared July 5th. And it's entitled COVID-19 Won't Change Us Forever. And I'd encourage you to read the entire thing, but some summary points. Within 3 years after 9/11, the airline industry set record high for passengers. The 1918 pandemic was followed by the Roaring '20s. In 1919, after the flu pandemic killed 675,000 Americans, Major League Baseball set an attendance record. We, as people, rebuild after disasters. Here's some examples. San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake, Chicago after the Great Fire of 1871, Warsaw, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, all examples of how we rebuild after disasters. And I think we've all heard of post-traumatic stress syndrome, but there are studies actually on post-traumatic growth. So trauma can be transformative, and people thrive after enduring negative life changes. So this is something I just wanted to throw out there to try to give some encouragement to the participants here today about what we expect to see after, or what we should see after COVID-19. And just before I close here, I wanted to point out, many of you probably get our weekly economic update, and this is something we make available to our Jobs EQ clients. If you're interested in getting a copy of this, it comes out every weekend, gives an overview of the economy, what numbers we saw last week, what's supposed to come out this week, maybe some highlights. Here you see initial unemployment claims that jumped up and are coming down, and some Fed speeches that are driving interest rates and policy. If you'd like a copy of that, let Avery know, and we'll be glad to add your name to our list. So with that, let me hand this over to James.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So yeah, I am going to introduce our state COVID recovery model that is based on our real-time intelligence, or RTI job postings data set. So first, I'm going to do a quick overview of our RTI data and what it is. So RTI is a high-frequency job postings data that Chmura collects, and it's collected from approximately 45,000 online job sources. So these are things like company career sites, where companies post their jobs directly onto their own web pages. And this makes up the large majority of the job postings that we collect. We also crawl from specialty job boards. These will be things like regional, local job boards, or even career-specific job boards. So, for example, something that is only specific to the nursing occupation. We also crawl from staffing agencies. So these are things like Aerotech or Kelly Services. And lastly, we will crawl from certain aggregator sites where companies are able to sometimes post directly onto a site like Monster or Indeed or other sites like that.
Hi, James. Your screen is currently circling in black. Can you try sharing it again?
Yes. 1 second.
There we go.
Got it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will just briefly go over what I just said then, so everyone gets that. So we crawl from approximately 45,000 online job sites. The bulk of those will be company career sites. We also, though, crawl from specialty job boards, staffing agencies, and aggregator websites. So RTI is updated daily, and that makes it probably the most immediate labor market information data source that you can get. Typical official data sources are updated monthly or quarterly, and they also have a 1 to 2 period lag in the data that you're going to be, that gets available. So for example, most recently updated data will be from the previous quarter or the previous month, whereas with RTI, it's updated daily and it's for that previous day. So for example, if you look at RTI on a Monday, you're going to be seeing all of the job postings and relevant data through that Sunday. So with these job postings, we classify them to identify relevant data points. This includes the location of the job posting, detailed occupation code, which we classify up to the 8-digit ONET SOC code, education, certification, skill requirements, and many other relevant data points that can be important in trying to use these job postings data as an indicator of the labor market and labor demand. And importantly, this data is strongly correlated with official employment data released from the BLS. So for example, we see this is a comparison. This chart shows a comparison of RTI to JOLT's job opening survey data. And you can see here that they track very, very closely. RTI new job posting counts tracks very closely to JOLT's openings. But again, a key advantage here with RTI is that we don't have that lag. So for example, in JOLT's, the most recent data point is from August, and that was released at the beginning of October. Whereas at the end of August, we had in RTI the full August data, and it's continuously being updated so that when you go and look at it, you can see October data right now. This next chart is a comparison of 2020 data to last year, 2019 data, beginning the first week of the year. And as Chris mentioned previously, a very important thing when considering the impact of the pandemic and the economy, at the beginning of the year, job posting volume was far outpacing 2019 levels, which is another indicator of just how strong the economy was leading up to the pandemic. And then from here, you can see that at the beginning of March, volume began to drop very rapidly. And this is when the impact of the COVID pandemic had really started to be realized. Many of the mandatory shutdown orders were put into place, and volume dropped by nearly half of pre-pandemic level highs. And then throughout the summer, there has been a steady increase in volume. And even at the end of August or September, you can see that we have actually now surpassed pre-pandemic levels, showing the recovery. However, one thing with this is that this is just a comparison to 2019. And as highlighted before, the economy at the beginning of the year was already stronger than 2019. So this type of comparison doesn't really tell the full story of the impact of the pandemic and the recovery after the fact. And so that leads into the recovery model that we developed to try to better understand the impact of the pandemic. And so to do this, we developed a model that would predict RTI job postings data under a scenario where the COVID-19 pandemic had never occurred. And we call this data our expected RTI volume. The model is based off of two primary indicators of volume, and this is seasonal trends, which are focused around holidays and holiday seasons, and historical volume changes. And again, by comparing this, it allows us to get a better picture of the true impact of the pandemic, as well as giving us a better idea of how far along in the recovery that we really are. So now I'm going to go into the model itself, and I will show you this website that we have developed or put together this page that we have put together on our website that shows all of the state level recovery data. So the first thing here is this nice map that shows for any given week. This tends to refresh when I haven't touched it for a while. So for any given week, you can go in here and you can take a look at a snapshot of each state's recovery progress. So for example, here we can see that both Nebraska and Oklahoma, as of the week of 9/20, are above their expected volume. And then you can look at some of the states, for example, like California here, where they are still 29% below expected. Texas, 22% below expected. And then if you click on any state, or if you just leave it unchecked and see the USA, you can scroll down and you can see now the time series for that particular region. So starting with the USA, I'll go over what the trend has been and how you can kind of interpret some of this data. So at the beginning of March, well, first, so highlighting the blue line here is our expected volume. So prior to the pandemic, this is actual observed volume. So this is what volume looked like initially. And then at the starting point of the pandemic, this is where we would have expected volume to be had the pandemic never occurred. And this is all indexed to the week of March 1st, which is the last week prior to the pandemic. So 1 is the week of March 1st, and then everything else is indexed from there. And again, very similar to like the 2019 comparison, observed volume dropped very rapidly at the beginning of the pandemic, and it reached a low on the week of April 5th at approximately 49% below expected volume. At that point, and throughout the summer, volume has seen a steady increase. And up through the week of August 25th, there has been approximately a 3.4% average weekly growth in observed volume relative to a 0.4% increase in expected volume. So in total, there's been just under 3% growth, average growth in essentially the recovery from the pandemic. And as of our most recent data, which is the week of September 20th, for the USA as a whole, we are approximately 20% below expected volume. And one thing important here is since the end of August, volume has stagnated a little bit. So it's after getting up to 13% below expected volume, it's kind of fallen back down and it's been hovering just below or at 20%. And this is an indicator of what many other sources have been suggesting, that the recovery appears to be slowing right now. So now I will go and highlight a couple of states. So the first state I want to highlight is one of the more unique cases, and that is Hawaii. So in Hawaii, the state is very heavily dependent on tourism. And that, as we've seen with other data, has been one of the most heavily impacted industries. And all of the occupations related to that industry, such as various food and restaurant occupations or entertainment and arts occupations, have been the hardest hit by the pandemic. So in Hawaii, there is a much sharper drop in volume, and it hit a low of 58% below expected, compared to the 49% that we saw for the USA as a whole. And another thing with Hawaii is that leading into the summer, we expect to see a pretty significant spike in volume, which is a hiring increase that happens leading into the summertime season, which is a very busy and popular season for travelers and tourism in general. And in this year, while we did see a little bit after hitting that low, there was a little bit of an increase. It never got to the kind of increase that we would typically expect. So Hawaii largely lost much of that increase. And because of that, Hawaii actually stayed near or even below 50% expected volume all the way through the end of July. And it wasn't until August when Hawaii really started to see an impact of the recovery. And as of most recent week, they are now at approximately 15% below expected volume. So that is a highlight of one of the more extreme negative cases. Next, I will show you one of the more positive or minimally impacted cases. So here we have Iowa. And Iowa is a lot of agriculture, which has been an industry that hasn't been as affected as much by the pandemic. And so here we can see when we look at Iowa's volume, first thing is you'll notice here that overall volume isn't really expected to grow too much at the beginning of the year. So throughout the summer, it hovers pretty close to around 1, meaning it stays relatively steady throughout the summer. So with here, what we see then in the observed volume is that it only dropped to 30% below expected, which is almost 20% less than what the USA as a whole was. It then recovered and stayed around 20% or so, a little bit below that, again, for much of the summer. And as of August, it has actually now gotten back to a point where it is almost effectively what we would say recovered, in the sense that job posting volume in Iowa now is right around our expected volume. So this is kind of what we are looking for across all of the states when they finally hit that recovered area where our observed volume is right around the expected volume. So that covers the examples that I wanted to highlight. Just a couple different things I'll point out for anyone who comes here and wants to look at their own state on this and read through some of the data. So just a couple of things. So you click on any state and it will bring down that state's time series chart. You can then just deselect off the map to unselect the state and bring back the USA as a whole. For some of these smaller states, you can also click on it to bring it up or deselect to not. You can also then click specifically on the change boxes here where we have it highlighted to bring up, you click on the state to bring up then the time series chart, but you have to deselect the state again to unselect it.
Hey, James, we had one person ask about California and Louisiana. Can we look at Louisiana, for example, that has seen the hurricanes? And
Yes.
The question was whether we adjusted for that, and I'm going to say that you did not, correct?
Correct. So this expected volume model does not account for any kind of unexpected or unknown event. So anything like the California wildfires, for example, hurricanes in the Gulf Coast, those are things that we haven't accounted for, largely because, in terms of a prediction, they're really impossible to account for. So this expected volume is purely just based off of typical trends. So you could theoretically say that the hurricane season is taken into account here, because the hurricane season of previous years will also be reflected in the expected volume. However, for example, this year being a much more severe hurricane season, I think, than normal, especially much more than the more recent years, that's something that would not be reflected. And of course, again, any specific hurricane event or any other just natural disaster type event like that will not be accounted for here.
Can we look at California? And my guess is that, so some of the drop off in Louisiana, we could say more recent, could have been from the hurricane, and same here. Some
Right.
of the drop off or the non-attaining the previous expected levels, we can just hypothesize that some of that is fire related and not just COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, yeah, like as you're looking at the recovery here, and if it does tend to drop off, that is very likely to be an impact. And we actually have in the past, if you go to our blogs, I have written about a handful of natural disaster events in the past and how what their impact on RTI volume is. So I believe I've looked at the hurricane that was in Houston a few years ago. I've also looked at some of the wildfires that happened in previous years in California. And there always is an impact in certain occupations, but it's never, those types of events never really have that dramatic of an effect. I mean, they're absolutely nothing compared to the effect that we've seen from COVID. They're also much more shorter in terms of duration. So for example, with the hurricane that we saw in Houston a couple years ago, I believe it was less than a month or very close to around that when we actually saw volume pretty much recover back to where we would typically expect it to see. So all to say, those kinds of events likely will be reflected here in what we're seeing. However, they would be a much smaller impact than the current pandemic and recovery situation that we are in right now.
Okay. James, I'm seeing another question out there. I mean, there are several for you, but since you're on this right now, so we know in Jobs EQ, we can go to any region or county or area and take a look at job postings today versus a year ago. You can look at it by occupation, but we don't have this expected volume down to the regional level, correct? And can you explain why we don't?
Right. Yeah, so that's right. So yeah, we only have it down to the state level, and we don't break it out by occupation at all. And the primary reason for that is just due to the quality of the data and having sufficient data to build a reliable model, where once you start breaking down into specific occupations or going even further than the state level, you ultimately end up getting too much noise in the data to really be able to produce a reliable prediction. And that was the key thing here when developing this model that we wanted to make sure that we had, was the most reliable predicted expected volume for comparison. Because if it's not reliable, then of course there's really not much meaning you can get from it. And so we have investigated trying to break it down, because of course it would be great to be able to see, like, how is the restaurant industry been affected compared to nursing or manufacturing or any of these other groups. But at least as of right now, just with the data available, we're not confident enough in those models and those predictions to really use those yet. So as of right now, right, it's just down to the state level and total all occupation.
Great, thanks. Avery, are there some other questions that you want to bring up to James?
Let me check. Okay. Does JobsEQ RTI monitor remote job postings versus non-remote? How can we get a handle on which of these job postings are for remote work?
That is a great question, and that's something that we are working on right now. I don't have an exact timeline on when it would be actually implemented into RTI. Mm-hmm. I would say before next summer we'll have it, which I know that sounds like a long time frame, but we are currently active working on it. It could potentially be sooner.
Could you use keywords to filter for remote jobs?
So you can. The thing with that though is, and this is something that we're working on in our process for identifying it, is a lot of times, and especially it's much more common now, you'll see something along the lines of remote or telecommute is not available. Essentially, you have a lot of these not cases. So that's the key thing that we're working on is in our actual process is being able to identify actual remote availability for an occupation versus those cases where it specifically says remote is not available. And I think just because remote work has become such a huge topic, we are seeing it much more often in new job postings going both ways, where it says that you can work remotely or where they want to explicitly say that remote work is not an option for that particular job.
That makes sense.
In the meantime, we do have a blog that we wrote on remote working. I believe Greg Chmura wrote it. And we've looked at all occupations and put them as whether they can work remote or can't or in between. And then, James, within JobsEQ, do we have those categories where you can pull up the remote occupations and look at the industries?
Yeah, so I believe, and I'm not entirely sure exactly how we have it set up, but I believe that we have a custom occupation group made for remote versus non-remote jobs so that you could look it up by that. But of course, that is by the occupation groups that we've identified.
Yeah, I just put the blog in the chat so you can look up and you can actually download your MSA's remote work index, i.e. like how many of the occupations in your MSA are suited to be worked remotely, and we go into depth on how you reached that analysis.
Right. And yeah, so we have within JobsEQ, and so you could look at this in any of the analytics, not just RTI. We have 3 different groupings that are specified and described in the blog itself. But we have these custom occupation groups for remote jobs, non-remote jobs, and then the partially remote jobs. And again, how those are defined is in that blog.
Yeah. I have another question. I think you touched on this before, but does this state recovery model consider how industries are recovering? This person says, in Orlando, most of our recent job posting activity has been driven by the healthcare industry, but I'm not sure we can call a surge in healthcare postings a quote recovery.
Right. Yeah. So again, yeah, that's something that we don't have broken out yet. It's something that you could certainly look at in RTI itself to see where the surges are. But yeah, it's not something that we account for in the recovery model itself, because again, that would require breaking it down into more detailed levels that we just don't have yet the information available for.
Right. Chris, or maybe James, how can people get JOLTS data by metro area?
I'm thinking, I don't think it's available by metro area. Is it, James?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Is it
That's something that we could probably follow up on. Give us a chance to ask one of our other data people who works on JobsEQ. They may know specifically at what levels it's available. Yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Alrighty. I'll make a note to follow up with you, Robin.
Any other questions?
That's all the questions I have now, but folk, type your questions in the chat if you have them, because we've got some time, which means we can address you very specifically.
And if there are no other questions, thank you for spending some time with us. This, as this continues on, and we have a lot of people staying at home, I know it gets more difficult. So I hope that you're able to get out and get some vacation if you haven't taken any yet, in a safe spot. And we have a question here. Can you show us how to get to the map again?
Yes. So if you just start here, so go to our website, chmuraecon.com. And then when you click on the COVID-19 section, we have the RTI State Recovery Model, which is the one that we were just on. We also have the Remote Work Index that we were talking about, along with an Economic Vulnerability Index that we've developed. And so you can just click on any of those. So you click on here for the State Recovery Model, and then it will bring up the map. And then click on a state if you want to highlight that particular state and the time series for that one. Of course, this is going to be a little buggy now. And then just simply either click on the state again or click off the map to deselect it and bring back the USA as a whole. And again, you can do this for the map. You can do this by week. So you can go on here and you can select any given week. So for example, April 5th was the where most states hit their low, and it's where the USA hit its low. And so you can see just how far below expected many of these states got.
Yeah. We have a question from Bill, which, James, you're the perfect person to answer. Bill asks, are you analyzing the job detail of the postings and trying to derive other attributes like education, experience, part-time, full-time, etc.?
Yes. So there's too much to go over right now as far as everything that we do parse out of the job postings data, but we do, all education, certification, skill requirements, we identify. The education requirements, we have it broken down by both the degree type that's required, along with any specific programs that may be required. We also identify things like the wages, the employers, of course, location and occupations, the job type as far as full-time, part-time, contract or permanent jobs, and many other different pieces within the job postings. And that you can all see on the RTI analytic within JobsEQ.
Yeah, one of the things I like about job postings is, so BLS identifies about 820 SOC codes, occupation classifications, but there are some that are, that are up and coming and we all know about, but they're not classified yet by BLS. So you can put in a keyword like cyber, and it will pull open the number of cyber jobs that are posted in an area. And then it will also identify what occupations are those cyber jobs related to. So you can create a category of cyber occupations and save that to use in the future. So yeah, there's a lot of neat stuff in our job postings data in Jobs EQ, and I'm sure one of our account managers would be happy to give you a demo if you're interested.
Right. Yeah, and Chris, I think that's a really great point. As far as like the keyword filter, I know I've come across many situations where we're looking at a particular job title that we can think of, but we're not quite sure what that occupation may necessarily go into. So that's a very great, powerful thing with RTI is you can search that job title, and then you can look at all of the different occupations that contain that title. And so that gives you a better idea, especially then going elsewhere into Jobs EQ, to see and know what specific occupations you should be looking at for the specific job that you're thinking about.
Okay.
Awesome.
It looks like we're coming on our 1 hour mark, and it looks like the questions have ended. If you do have more questions, feel free to reach out to your account manager or write to Avery, and she'll get back in touch with us so that we can get back to you. So again, please be safe, wear your masks, and go out and spend some money. So have a good afternoon.